This candy dish can be made from just about any kind of wood that you have available. You don't need a whole bunch of wood. It's easy to make and it goes pretty quick. This is a piece of ambrosia maple that's just 2 1/4 inches thick. And at 7 3/4 by 8 inches, it's not quite square. And that means that using one of these center finders is pretty much useless. Chances are they're going to leave a pretty good window for error. I find it can be more accurate just using my centering tape measure. I just measure and mark the center on both widths, and that gives me a real nice picture of where the center of this mass actually is. It's simple, quick, and I don't waste much wood this way. I'm going to mount this piece on my Talon one-way chuck using a woodworm screw, so I need to drill a hole in the center that's 9 millimeters in diameter and 3/4 of an inch deep. I want to lay out a circle so I can trim away some of the excess wood. But because of the wax on this piece, the pencil won't work. So I put the pencil in the punch hole and use a scratch awl on the outside to scratch in the wax to give me a rough idea where I want to cut away some of the waste. It's actually harder to see the scratch line in this video than it is in person. I'm going to make these cuts by hand because all I'm trying to do is stay outside of these lines and just knock off some of the mass on the corners. This blade is much too wide to follow that arc, so I'll make 1 or 2 passes on each corner to get rid of most of the wood. This doesn't take long to do and there's no special jigs, but I can put it on a lathe and not have those scary looking corners swinging around to get this thing started. You do want to pay attention and keep your hands on the other side of the piece. I have my chuck installed on a lathe and now I can begin threading the wood onto the woodworm screw. I'm just going to get it started here by hand, and then I'm going to bring the tailstock up. I like to add the tailstock to it to add a little pressure to the wood to make sure it stays straight as I thread it on the woodworm screw. And I'll leave the tailstock in place while we begin rounding this out just to make it a little more stable. I've turned larger pieces in this with just the woodworm screw, but adding the tailstock is just a little bit of a safety factor. After setting my tool rest, I can start with my big scraper to start rounding this piece out. This is a big heavy tool and certainly could take a bigger bite, but I'm just going to take my time and work this piece down so you can keep the surface as smooth as you can. Taking light cuts also reduces the possibility of splitting off a big chunk. The outer diameter is just about perfectly round, so I'm going to start angling the bottom edge in. We want to cut a big taper on the side of this bowl, and when we finish, you won't believe that it came out of this little thickness of wood. A relatively steep angle on the sides of a bowl will make it look taller. And here the angle's getting quite a bit steeper, and the bowl's already starting to look taller. Here I've changed to a round cutter from Easy Wood Tools. I like how these tools handle, they resist vibration real well, and leave a good surface. I'm going to use this tool for most of the turning on this dish. Now I can start smoothing out the bottom of this dish. At first I'm going to make the bottom flat, but we want to wind up with the bottom that sweeps in a little bit from the edges. When a dish or bowl stands just on a rim around the bottom, it's more stable on surfaces that might not be perfectly flat, which hardly any of them are. When we dish out the bottom, we create a little clearance that it can straddle some imperfections in the surface it's standing on. Here I'm going to lay out for a recess in the bottom of the bowl so I can turn this around and put it on the jaws of the chuck. I'm using a square tip cutter held at a little bit of an angle to cut a dovetailed recess that we can slip over the jaws. There's nothing fancy here, and it's about 3/8 of an inch deep. And here's the recess. Need to sand the edge of it a little bit because I fuzzed it up trying to hurry for the camera. Now I'm just going to slip that recess over the jaws, hold the piece flat on the chuck, and expand the jaws outward to grip the edges of that recess. This is a very simple system that holds a bowl blank very securely. And here I'll whip out my big scraper again to level this side of the bowl. Here again, I could take a lot deeper cuts, but all we're going to do is overstress the wood. It doesn't take long at all to smooth this off. And now I'll switch back to the round Easy Woodworking Tools cutter. And I'll use this to shape the interior and remove all of the wood. This tool cuts so well that sometimes I find myself cutting way too deep, and I've actually stopped the wood a couple of times. That's not a problem with the lathe. That's me trying to cut too much off at once. I'd like to say that I never make a mistake when I'm turning, but that just isn't true. Okay, now we're a lot farther into this piece now. When I get this deep into a piece, I start working more on the sides than I am on the bottom. I leave the sides a little thick initially, but then after I get my depth figured out, then we can start working the sides and shaping them into the bottom. And yes, that is a hole in the bottom of the dish. Normally that'd be a disaster, but because this is a candy dish and I'm going to put a handle in there, I actually wanted a hole. I just didn't know I was going to find it that soon. I have the shape that I want, so now we're going to sand this thing for a while. Notice how I'm holding the paper between my fingers. If something happened where the bowl actually grabs the paper, it'll just jerk it out from between my fingers and not wrap my hand up. And now you get to see how close I was to really messing this dish up. The plan all along here was to make a 1/2-inch hole in the bottom, and the hole I made wasn't a whole lot smaller than the 1/2 inch that I wanted. But it was smaller, so now it looks pro. Here I'm turning the handle out of a piece of wood I cut out of a pallet a couple of years ago. As you'll see, I didn't get real fancy with this, but you can get as creative as you want. The main thing is you want some kind of knob on the top so you can lift the dish with this handle. Now I'll just run a bead of super glue around the tenon that I cut in the bottom of this handle and stick it into the dish. And if all goes right, it should fit right in, and we're in business. I'll let this dry a while, and then we'll turn it over and put some epoxy on the bottom of this tenon just to make sure. And with a little bit of wood and a couple hours worth of work, you got a nice candy dish you can give somebody. And remember, this came out of that 2 1/4 inch thick block of wood that we had. Sure doesn't look like it, does it?